Hi, everybody. I'm Tara McGowan, founder, publisher of COURIER. So excited to be joined by Heather Cox Richardson, who actually was able to enter the chat. The fourth time we tried it is the charm. Heather, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. A little bit overwhelmed by everything going on, as I suspect you are as well.
Well, very much so. Every day, fresh new nightmare. But your calming words in your Substacks every single day bring a sense of calm and context. Context for me is calm. I don't know if that's
Me
calm
too.
for everybody, but I get the sense it is for
You know what
you.
it is? It's that your feet are under you. Like if you don't know what's going on, you just never feel like your feet are under you. And if so long as you know where the firm spots are, you're okay.
That's right. I took my first ever martial arts class last night, and we did a lot with grounding.
hmm
And it's the same thing. You just, you use the ground beneath you, and it helps us steady ourselves. So I do find that to be your voice in this moment and all of the amazing work you've been doing. And really excited to have this conversation because it's slightly different, but obviously very relevant and adjacent to all of the things that are happening right now in our political climate, in the fight over democracy right now. But I wanted to talk specifically about media and the state of media, and you have a personal story we'll get to related to, I don't know if you ever imagined yourself to become a very prolific and popular creator or called such that in this day and age. But before we talk about sort of the state of media today, I really actually, and as a like I'm excited as a fan of yours and a student of this to really talk actually about the history of media in this country, and what's relevant about that in this moment. I don't know how many folks on right now know sort of how freedom of the press made it into the First Amendment, but also just the role that, how media started in this country, how freedom of the press became so integral, to freedoms and our rights, and how media existed for a long time up until sort of the modern era. So you can take that any direction you want, Heather, but I think it would be really helpful to kind of ground us again, before we start talking about what the role of media is today and the risks and threats involved in that.
So that's a lot of stuff to cover, actually, and I'll see if I can highlight some stuff
Definitely.
because, what is freedom of the press? Why do we care about freedom of the press? And there are a number of aspects to that. One is that you need to have a press in a democracy be able to inform people about what the government is doing honestly, so that they can make good decisions when they go to the voting booth. And that's a real question in the early republic, because there came this idea of freedom of the press long before the United States was ever conceived, in an early trial by a guy named John Peter Zenger. And the idea that he could criticize the government becomes this huge deal. But then the question is, what are they going to do in the early republic? What does it mean? What does it mean to be able to criticize the government or to be able to have a free press? And in 1798, we get the Sedition Act, which says, no, actually, you can't criticize the government. And that sucker gets deep sixed pretty fast. But if you think about the news in that era, the news was not the way we understand it nowadays. Newspapers were expensive, they were hard to produce. And here's the other thing about freedom of the press: it's not just being able to say anything, it's about being able to have access to the channels in which you can say everything. That makes a really big difference, because you could say, hey, listen, anybody can say anything, but only the official word of, say, the Pentagon is going to be able to travel through the mails or going to be able to be on the internet or whatever. And so access becomes a critical part of freedom of the press. But in those early days, the papers and the news was only what a newspaper editor thought an educated man should know. It wasn't what happened yesterday. It was, the German Duke of whatever did whatever, and the news was not current. It came out whenever. It was just the idea that you were sort of current with what was happening in the world. That changes really dramatically in the 1840s and the 1850s, when we start to get the rise of news that has just come out. And that news at first is really salacious. It's like the murders and the, sort of the yellow journalism, although that's a term from later
The
on.
gossip.
And Yes, and in the gossip, that's right. And in the 1850s, we start to get the rise of the idea of news that you need to know on a daily basis. Now, in those early years, in the 1850s on until about the 1880s, that's going to be highly partisan. So a Democratic newspaper is going to look one way, a Whig newspaper is going to look another way. And the Republican Party, when it rises in the mid 1850s, uses the news really, really effectively. It's basically a newspaper party.
Wait, can we pause? What year was that, Heather?
1850,
Because
1850s.
it could have been 1995 or 2025 for
The
that
Republican
matter.
Party, the Republican Party has always used news well. But it becomes so partisan that people really start to argue that they need to have nonpartisan news, news that just tells you what's important, largely in the government, but elsewhere as well. So by the 1890s, we start to get the rise of nonpartisan news, independent news, and the idea that it's informing people what they need to know to make good decisions about the government. And we can take it from there into the 20th century, but that idea of nonpartisan news that informs you what's happening with your government strikes me as being key right now, because I think we're seeing the exact same thing with the rise of independent news today.
That's right. And there's this sort of 2 points I want to dig in on there. The first is that in sort of my trajectory of starting my career in journalism, working through politics, and then starting Courier just under 7 years ago, it was interesting to me. So many folks did not actually know the history and origins of partisan media as sort of the origins of press in America in a lot of ways. And then we did find our way to nonpartisan and quote unquote objective media. And I think most would agree that that is a really good and important thing. And fast forward to today, we are back into a new modern version of decentralized media and information, where frankly, transparent media and point of view media and advocacy media, whether it's partisan or not, I don't know that partisan is the right word anymore. It is actually more trusted in a lot of ways, or more prevalent at the very least, than nonpartisan media, and that's not an accident. So maybe you could talk a little bit about sort of what has chipped away at sort of the ideal kind of nonpartisan media for people to be able to get more of a balance of information that isn't propaganda.
So one of the problems that we've gotten into, and I would date this from the early 1970s with America's theoretically nonpartisan news, there's two big problems. One is the corporatization of the news media, so that rather than thinking of many news outlets as being news outlets, they're essentially corporations that have a newsroom. And that means that they have many things to worry about before they worry about making sure that people are adequately informed about the news. They're worried about government contracts, for example. So that's one problem. But another problem is when you think of nonpartisan news as being basically throwing spaghetti at the wall and letting your readers decide what is true and what is relevant, because we get in there into the problem of the fire hose of news, the idea of political virtual politics, for example, it's called, the idea that you can steer people away from political involvement altogether simply by throwing so much at them they tune out. And that's my problem today with a lot of legacy media. They have great reporters. They have some great opinion writers. They're really good people. I'm not one of these people who's like, throw them all in the ditch. But there often is what we tend to call both sidesing, the idea that if you say one person says one thing, you have to say the other person says something else. And one of the places you see this manifested today, I think, is when the Trump administration does something that legal scholars, historians, lawmakers will say that's illegal. And you will have a major legacy paper saying, some people say it's illegal. Well, some people say anything. So in terms of trusting what people have to say, I would rather hear somebody who is not necessarily in the legacy media, that I know where they stand and I can read them and I can say, hey, that's really cool. Maybe I want to think a little bit more about this particular point. But, here's a great example. And I try not to drop names because, I want people to make their own decisions, but I think this is a pretty obvious one. When Paul Krugman was writing for the New York Times, I rarely read him. It just was so careful that I felt like something was always slipping away from me. And now that he's out on his own with his own Substack, I never miss a day. because there's always something really interesting. And I learn a lot of stuff there that I didn't even know I wanted to know. And that, I think, looks a lot like the 1890s did when we got the rise of that, what people call advocacy journalism, but it's really just let's dig in and tell you exactly what is happening. And then we got the rise of a number of different newspapers. At one point in the United States, we had literally hundreds of Black newspapers in the country, but also indigenous newspapers and labor newspapers and newspapers in all kinds of different languages. But we also got the rise of what were called the muckrakers, derogatorily by Theodore Roosevelt, but people who are digging into issues that matter to people on an everyday basis and saying, hey, this is how the city of Minneapolis runs. Are you okay with this? And when people actually learned what was happening, they were like, no, I'm really not. Corruption's a bad thing, and I want to take that on. And from that, we got a really, really different political moment. And that's what it feels like to me here now with things like Courier.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, since the COURIER's been around, as I mentioned, 6.5 years, but since the 2024 election, we went from 4 million subscribers to 8 million without a dollar on growth. And that was purely because people were actually hungry for information. I think mostly our audience that comes to us, right, they're already alarmed. They're already concerned about what's happening, and specifically related to this administration. But it also shows an increased desire for information that they can trust. And that's a thread I kind of wanted to pull on about what you were saying about Paul Krugman, and certainly all of the millions of folks that follow you readily to get their news and information as someone who is not a journalist, a reporter, in the traditional sense by any means, is I think it always comes down to trust. And that's not new. I think individuals, whether, it was back in Walter Cronkite, Edward Murrow, it's always been individuals that have been the ones that people have invited into their homes or been the sort of arbiters of information and truth for them. But today, there has been a immense loss of trust in corporate media, in legacy media, in traditional media formats. I think the Gallup poll that came out a few months ago had it at only 28% of Americans have confidence in newspapers and broadcast journalism today, traditional media. And I personally very much believe that it is because, and like the rise of creators, especially ones that aren't trained as journalists that people go to for information, it's because they do feel a level of trust. They feel a level of humanity too, right? Like we're both talking from our homes. There's a different access level than we've had before, in this kind of digital information ecosystem. So I'd love for you to talk about, what does the role of trust mean today, and how do we ensure, though, that folks are trusting folks that are giving them quality information, whether that is, by the same standards of legacy media or new modern standards.
I think you're right that trust matters hugely. And that doesn't mean that people don't make mistakes, but just like your friends make mistakes, they will say, hey, I screwed up and I'm going to fix that. This is a big thing for me because I am virtually innumerate. Numbers mean almost nothing to me unless they're written out as words. So the difference between 24 million and 42 million means absolutely nothing to me. And so almost once a week, somebody's like, you got a little problem there with your, transposing your numbers there. It's like, oops, I can fix it, right? So you just know that if
You
you
and I
read me.
share that. I always wonder what the word for dyslexia for numbers is because I have it. At any
It is a
rate,
thing. It is a
yeah,
thing. Yeah.
good.
Um,
Glad to know.
do you know your left from your right?
Not always.
Yeah, me neither. No, it's a thing. It's a thing. That my children pointed out to me that if I know where I'm going, I turn right, and if I don't know where I'm going, I turn left, which is really not an effective way to get anywhere. But so there is, I think the trust really matters. And like I say, there are certainly still people in the legacy media that I trust, that I read every time they write something. So it's not, this I don't think is about trashing one era versus another. But the real issue is the one you identify. How do you know who is giving you good information? And I see this all the time when there's a new somebody who pops up, or there are people who use our production to cut it into AI videos that are not us, right? So how do you do that? And the only answer that I can say is always, always, always to be skeptical. That is, you ought to know the voices of the people you trust by now. And if they are saying something that seems to you really out of whack, realize that that's the case. So if you already know somebody, that's one thing. But if you don't know somebody, There are ways to check, and Google is your friend on this, or any search engine is your friend on this. If you hear something that sounds outrageous, go to a search engine and type it in and look and see who has reported it. Are those reputable places or are they not? And, it's really easy if you do it that way to recognize if something is a real story or not. Because if it's only being reported by, doesn't mean that it has to be reported by major outlets. But, if it's not being reported by people who are trustworthy outlets, wait a few days. One of the things I learned when I taught at MIT was anybody who was trying to make you do something really quickly. In that case, it was about fraud, but anybody trying to make you do something and react really quickly does not have your best interests at heart. So if you read something absolutely outrageous, take a breath. Give it a day or two. Nothing major is going to change, at least on the national or even the state scale, in a couple of days. If they're saying get out of the way of a hurricane, don't sit there for a couple of days. But if they're saying, my favorite was that Oklahoma is going to impose Sharia law. I used to live in Oklahoma. They were not going to be imposing Sharia law, and that went everywhere, right? So you can check these things really easily just by typing them into a search engine and seeing who else is talking about them. And if it's all fringe people, let it breathe for a while and see where it goes.
That's right. Or alternately, if you can't find anything about them, it's probably not a trusted source. But that's why it's so important to follow the people and the accounts that you trust and not share if you don't know. Because I've been victim to that as well, where there was like such a high quality AI video. I think it happened actually to me. I immediately got called out. I was so happy. Somebody was like, "Nope, I think it's AI," because it was Jimmy Kimmel responding. He had not responded, but it's like we have that sort of quick to share when something feels newsy, and we have to be able to fight that. So I do, on that note, I want to talk about freedom of speech and freedom of press as sort of two really, really, really core freedoms, constitutional freedoms that we have in this country that both feel at threat right now. But also I have found some really wonderful and surprising, in a good way, sources of hope out of the reaction of the American public to when these things have been threatened, and not just the public, but some media. And the two examples I wanted to talk about quickly was first the Pentagon policy that came out that Pete Hegseth, the now Department of War, released for journalists that would prohibit access and even news gathering among reporters in the Pentagon press corps from being able to do any independent reporting and reporting on anything that wasn't specifically unclassified for them. These are very, very unprecedented restrictions. And we saw Fox News and Newsmax not sign on to that policy and join other reporters from organizations like the Associated Press and New York Times walk out of the Pentagon and be very quickly replaced by right-wing bloggers and media professionals. And I was very surprised and heartened to see that Fox News and Newsmax actually participated in that walkout from the Pentagon. So that's one example where I feel like, again, we need folks to stand together to push back against this administration and these attacks on freedom of press. And then the other one to respond to is on freedom of speech, where I really felt after the Charlie Kirk assassination and Disney, Hulu, Paramount pulling Jimmy Kimmel, the immediate response, which hit them where it hurts, which is their wallets. We now know billions of dollars lost in membership from that decision that brought Jimmy Kimmel back. That was so heartening and inspiring to show the individual power we all have to push back against these really egregious oversteps on our freedom. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, you can choose one or go in any direction you want, Heather.
Well, the Defense Department, and it is still the Defense Department, Congress would have to change that name. The Defense Department wasn't just unclassified material, it was any unauthorized
That's right.
material, which is a really big deal. They're basically saying you need to be stenographers. And some of the people who have become those stenographers include Tim Pool, who before the 2024 election was discovered to be being paid by Russia. He's a Russian propagandist. So that itself is interesting. But to be clear, the Pentagon reporters, who were always crackerjack good, by the way, I used to listen to them all the time, they can still do their job. They just can't do it by talking to the people who were giving information out of the Pentagon, although that stuff that was coming out was crap anyway. So maybe this will help
Gonna
them,
say, talk about
get
trust.
get more time in their day. So that is a real attempt on the part of this administration to stifle what people can do. And they're talking, they're doing a lot of other things as well. But that pushback that you identify over Jimmy Kimmel, I think, was extraordinarily important, because what that said to corporate owners in this country was that for all the fact that they thought they had to please MAGA Republicans in order to do business, it turned out they needed to please the people who are not MAGA Republicans. And what's interesting about that is that Americans historically, and this is a really broad statement that lots of people could argue with, but historically, they tend not to care a lot about what's going on in the country so long as things seem okay. I always think about it like, do you vote, if you've gone to college, do you vote for whoever the board of overseers is or whatever? I mean, you throw those babies right in the trash unless there's something really going on, right?
Right. That's right.
So sorry, all my alma maters, but I do, right? So in this case, what really turns Americans out to vote, especially white middle class Americans, are the realization that they are losing their fundamental rights. And very little hits home more harshly than the loss of freedom of speech. Freedom of the press, yes, but freedom of speech and freedom of assembly. And you're seeing freedom of assembly right now taking a terrible hit in Chicago. And you look at this attempt of this administration to take away those fundamental American rights. And right now it's not going terribly well. And it's one thing to they set up, I think, this idea of going after undocumented migrants with the idea that this would be something that people would largely ignore, voters would largely ignore. But that was clearly an attempt to drive a wedge in society, with the hopes that I think that white voters wouldn't notice and wouldn't care. But by doing so, they have stepped over into the loss of rights for middle class Americans, especially middle class white Americans. And like I say, it's not going very well because we care deeply about those rights in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And as you say, first among equals there is freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. Also, by the way, freedom of religion.
That's right. And we know that attacks on each of those freedoms is part of the authoritarian playbook. And we know that that is the playbook that they are implementing right now really rapidly. And so I want to be really mindful of your time because we got a late start, Heather. So I'll try to close it up with this question. But with all of these freedoms at massive risk right now, but people speaking out to your point and standing up, and we're going to see more of that as sort of their grip tightens on these freedoms. I'm really curious about, obviously we work on this at Courier, but the role of independent media, also the role of citizens though right now, because right now we still have a good amount of press and journalism that is operating to the degree that is free and fair, including independent, but also some other media. But we are seeing a lot of capitulation by corporate owned media, right, that are paying to play. One of the things that keeps me up at night is all of the reporting that is no longer happening. Right? You don't know what you don't know. That's one of the things that scares me about the concessions and the capitulation we've seen from news organizations like CBS, NBC, ABC. And so the need for independent media feels greater than ever, at least in my lifetime in this country. And yet, are they safe? And what can citizens do to make sure that good information continues to break through so people are aware of the attacks, the assaults, the infringements on their freedoms, so they are able to speak out, to organize, to protest?
So let's start with an observation about not knowing what you don't know. What really jumps out to me is how little Americans know or are informed about foreign affairs. I
Right.
mean, when I was a kid, every newsroom had foreign reporters, and we just don't have them anymore. That's a real loss. Now, what's happening right now in this moment, I think you identified earlier when you talked about how quickly your subscriptions went up. I think independent media is definitely picking up the slack that the corporate media is not. But if you think about what individuals can do. The thing that always strikes me in this moment is that we're not really talking just about media, and we're not really talking just about government or democracy. What we're really talking about is society as a whole. And of course, support your local media, your truly local media. Lots of new media outlets around that you can support, but you can also make sure that you share that through social media, by talking to people at the grocery store and so on, not as in you need to read this newspaper so much as here is what is really happening. Because what we need to do is change the public conversation and to call out those outlets that are repeating crap and say that's not really what's happening. Because, at the end of the day, my brother's an educator, and he always says, people are wired to learn. And it's true, because if we weren't wired to learn, we would have all gotten eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, right? So the question is what we learn. And people don't, I think, want to be lied to. But when you've had a media ecosystem that really was commandeered in the 1980s by a right-wing movement to convince Americans of things that are not true, it's become enormously powerful. And I think you saw that yesterday with the release of that idea for what Democrats should be doing going forward. And even people who were Democratic operatives identified a number of issues as being Democratic issues when they were not Democratic issues. They were what Republicans said were Democratic issues. And untangling that and standing firm on really what is happening rather than the false world that is being forced upon us is going to be crucial going forward to make sure, like I started out by saying, we have the ground under our feet. And in that, everybody can take a stand, and it's okay to back away if it's too much stuff, take a break. But anytime you hear something wacky, look it up. Is that really happening? Because at the end of the day, most of our lawmakers and most of the people who are trying to move this country forward are just people. Are they really going to be doing something wackadoodle? Well, some of them are, and you can probably guess which ones those are. But if you're hearing that somebody is trying to do something like, for example, imposing Sharia law in Oklahoma, take a look and see whether or not it's real. And if it isn't real, make sure you don't share it and that you push back on it when other people do. Because if we can turn that sort of that false information back into, I always think of it as at the tabloids, at the news, before we had the internet, the tabloids were at the supermarket with Bat Boy, remember, and all that stuff. That's fine. I mean, that stuff is like, it's okay that that stuff's out there. The problem is when people think Bat Boy is real.
That's right.
And with the ability of the internet to amplify that sort of trash everywhere, people have started to believe that the world is flat, that vaccinations are bad for you, that, that there's going to be Sharia law in Oklahoma. And then they make decisions based on that false reality. And that's how we're in this mess, where a lot of people thought they were voting for things they were not, or thought they were voting against things they were not, and they're ending up with a plate full of stuff they didn't expect and that isn't going to be able to carry us successfully into the 21st century. So anybody can have a real effect on that.
That's absolutely right. And we always say at Courier that the best antidote to and false information, just conspiracy theories, is good information. And I want to underscore what you said, Heather, which is everybody has agency to share wherever they share their family text threads, their social media, the sources that they do trust and follow and have verified and that are good at giving good news and information. Your Substack, the Courier Newsroom Networks, there's so many that are out there doing this great work that need support, financial support, but also just spreading the word about them, because there is so much crap online. There is so much disinformation, and there's going to be more with AI slop, as we talked about. And so I think that's so important. I'm so grateful for you and everything you've done and how you've become a true, absolute leader in this news creator space, Heather, in informing folks and keeping them calm but engaged, which matters so much. My very favorite sign I saw, which I'm sure you've heard a ton of times from the No Kings rally, was that I'm not gonna, it was something along the lines of like, I'm not going to rest until Heather Cox Richardson tells me everything's okay. I think that that's such an unbelievable gift you have, and we're grateful for you sharing it. Is there anything I didn't ask you about this topic or others you want to say before we wrap?
No, I love what you're doing. I think, that this is, as you say, a matter of individual agency where people are saying we're not happy with the world the way it is, so we're going to try and build a new one. And for all that that's frightening and overwhelming, it's also incredibly creative and joyful. And that, sometimes when it's 2 o'clock in the morning and my head's asleep on the desk, I think, why am I doing this? And I think, how lucky I am to be able to do this. And so I would just urge people to remember that there is joy in rebuilding this country.
There is. This time chose us. Well, thank you, Heather, so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this wonderful conversation and sticking it out through the tech difficulties. Really appreciate you and your time, Heather. Thanks, everybody.
Back at you. Thanks a lot.